Soviet pilots had a nickname for it: Kitovi, the whale. Fat, slow, absurdly underpowered for a jet. When they spotted one lumbering through Korean airspace in late 1952, they'd radio back jokes. Some guy in a MiG-15 allegedly told his wingman it looked like someone strapped engines to a shipping container. The laughter stopped around November. That's when the whales started killing them. The Douglas F-3D Skyknight wasn't supposed to be in Korea at all. Navy built it for carrier operations, which tells you everything about its design philosophy. Survive a deck landing. Don't win beauty contests. Crews called it the Drut, which I'm told is turd backwards, though that might be apocryphal. Doesn't matter. The thing looked like a pregnant fuselage with stubby wings and two Westinghouse J-34 turbojets that produced all the thrust of an asthmatic lawnmower. But it had radar. Not the primitive tail warning stuff most fighters carried. Real intercept radar. The Westinghouse AN/APQ-35, tucked into that bulbous nose, could track targets at ranges the Soviets didn't think possible for airborne systems. The Marine squadrons flying them, VMFN 5113 mainly, call sign Flying Nightmares, had two-man crews. Pilot up front, radar operator behind him in a compartment so cramped he had to crawl in through a belly hatch. Soviet doctrine didn't account for this. Their night bombing runs over Korea followed patterns established in World War II. Visual navigation, known landmarks, get in fast and get out. MiG-15s provided top cover, trusting their speed advantage. Nobody trained them on what to do when an American radar set paints you from 12 miles away in total darkness. The first recorded kill happened November 2, 1952. I won't pretend to know what Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Corvée was thinking when his RO, radar operator, called out a contact northwest of Pyongyang. The intercept took 14 minutes. Corvée never saw the target visually, just followed the steering directions coming through his headset, closed to firing range, and put a burst of 20 millimeters into something that exploded orange against the clouds. Wreckage confirmed it was a Yak-15. The Air Force refused to credit it officially for 3 weeks because nobody believed you could shoot down an aircraft you never actually saw with your eyes. Here's what the Soviets didn't grasp. The Skyknight wasn't fighting them in a dogfight. It was hunting. Slow didn't matter when you detected the target first. Maneuverability meant nothing when you ambushed from a firing solution the enemy couldn't see coming. The F-3D's 420 mm cannons sat in the lower fuselage. No gun harmonization issues, no convergence point to calculate. Point and shoot. By December, Marine crews were getting multiple intercepts per mission. The MiGs kept coming, kept flying the same routes, kept assuming their speed made them untouchable. Soviet commanders apparently never revised their tactical doctrine, which strikes me as either incredible arrogance or catastrophic institutional paralysis. Probably both. January 1953 was a bloodbath. The kill board at K6 Air Base started filling with red stars. 6 confirmed in 1 month, all at night, all beyond visual range. The Skyknight became the only jet aircraft in Korea with an exclusively nocturnal air-to-air record. Air Force pilots flying F-94 Starfires, supposedly the premier American night fighter, watched their Navy counterparts rack up kills and quietly seethed. Soviet intelligence eventually figured out what was killing their aircraft. Too late. The nickname changed from whale to something I've never seen translated, but the tone wasn't mocking anymore. Douglas Aircraft didn't design the Skyknight to win anything. They designed it to not die. The Navy's 1946 requirements read like someone's anxiety checklist. All-weather capability, carrier compatible, radar intercept, survivable if one engine quits. Performance specifications came last. Nobody mentioned graceful or intimidating anywhere in the contract documents. What emerged looked like Douglas engineers took a medium bomber fuselage, cut it in half, then attached the smallest wings they could get away with. The wings were straight, no sweep, because swept wings were still experimental, and the Navy wanted something that wouldn't kill ensigns on their third carrier landing. 2 Westinghouse J-34 turbojets hung under the wings like afterthoughts. Each produced 3,400 pounds of thrust, which sounds adequate until you realize the loaded weight was 26,000 pounds. Ed Heinemann led the design team. He'd already given the Navy the A-1 Sky Raider, which meant he understood the service's pathological fear of complicated systems failing at sea. The F-3D reflected that. Hydraulics? Redundant. Electrical? Triple backup. The radar operator sat behind the pilot in what was essentially a phone booth with instruments. No ejection seat initially, because those were still experimental and therefore untrustworthy. Just a belly hatch. Crawl in before flight, crawl out after. If something went wrong at altitude, good luck. The Air Force took one look at the prototype and passed. Too slow for daylight interception, too heavy for dogfighting, insufficient ceiling for bomber escort. Their assessment wasn't wrong. The F-3D topped out around 480 knots and couldn't break 38,000 feet without wheezing. A MiG-15 could hit 670 knots and operate comfortably at 50,000 feet. On paper, asking an F-3D to fight a MiG was like asking a city bus to chase a Ferrari. But the Air Force was still thinking about dogfights. The Marines looked at the Sky Knight and saw something different, a radar platform that happened to have guns. VMFN 5113 and VMFN 542 started receiving them in 1951. Carrier trials were mixed. The thing could land on a deck technically, but it required so much runway nobody trusted it on anything smaller than the Midway class. So they based it on land in Korea instead. Crews hated it at first. Climbing into that radar compartment felt like being buried alive. The cockpit visibility was mediocre, all that fuselage blocking your view. And the performance, God. You couldn't outrun anything if a MiG decided you looked interesting. One Marine captain told reporters it flew like a dump truck with wings, which made the wire services and didn't help morale. Then the kill confirmations started coming in. Soviet pilots didn't know what hit them because the F-3D fought outside visual range. The Westinghouse APQ-35 radar could track targets at 12 to 15 miles in good conditions. The pilot got steering cues, the RO called ranges, and the guns fired when the pipper lined up. No swirling dogfight, no energy management, no worrying about turn radius. Just cold geometry and trigonometry. I think the Air Force resented this. Their F-94 Starfires had similar radar systems, but never achieved the same kill ratios. Maybe it was crew training. Maybe Marine ROs were just better at their jobs. Maybe the Sky Knight's stable platform made radar tracking easier. Official reports don't say, which usually means someone important got embarrassed. By mid-1953, the Sky Knight had erased more enemy jets in night combat than every other UN aircraft combined. Douglas never advertised this. The records got buried in classified mission reports, and when the war ended, everyone went back to talking about sabers and MiGs and daylight heroics. The whale kept swimming. Korea's air war had 2 shifts. The day shift made headlines. Sabers versus MiGs over the Yalu. Dogfights at 40,000 feet. Gun camera footage that looked good in newsreels. Then the sun set and different aircraft took over. Soviet and Chinese night bombers owned the darkness for the first 18 months. They'd cross the Yalu after 2,200 hours, navigate by moonlight and landmarks, hit supply depots or troop concentrations, disappear before anyone scrambled interceptors. UN casualties mounted. Nobody could stop them because nobody could find them. Searchlights didn't work. Bombers stayed above the beams. Radar-directed Tropaway got close but rarely scored kills. You needed an aircraft that could hunt in zero visibility, track a target through clouds, and kill it before the bomber crew knew they were being followed. In 1951, America didn't have that. Not really. The Air Force tried. Their F-94 Starfires had radar, but early models suffered catastrophic reliability issues. Radar sets failed mid-mission. Fire control systems gave false contacts. Pilots reported tracking phantom targets for 30 minutes before realizing the scope was malfunctioning. One squadron commander admitted they were shooting at ghosts and hoping. The Marines brought a different philosophy. They'd been running night fighter operations since Guadalcanal, F-6F Hellcats with primitive radar sets hunting Japanese bombers in 1943. That institutional knowledge mattered. When VMFN 5113 arrived at Kunsan in August 1952 with their Sky Knights, the crews already understood radar intercept doctrine. The ROs had trained for months on the APQ-35 system, knew its quirks, could differentiate real contacts from ground clutter. Soviet bomber patterns were predictable. They'd approach from the northwest, follow the coast south, turn inland at recognizable features. Same altitudes, same speeds, same routes week after week. I don't know if this was doctrinal inflexibility or just poor operational security, but it made them easy to kill once you had the right equipment. The Sky Knight patrols ran 4 to 5 hours. Crews would orbit assigned sectors, usually near Pyongyang or Wonsan, waiting for contacts. The RO stared at the radar scope, watching the green sweep, looking for returns that behaved like aircraft instead of mountains. When something appeared, he'd call bearing and range. The pilot adjusted heading, closed the distance, waited for the RO to confirm lock. Most intercepts happened between 15,000 and 25,000 feet. Total darkness, heavy clouds, zero moon. Conditions where visual identification was impossible. The RO would guide the pilot into firing position, usually about 1,500 feet behind the target. 4 20mm cannons, each loaded with a mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive incendiary rounds. Typical burst was 2 seconds. Then you waited to see if something exploded. Major William Stratton got 3 kills in November 1952 alone. All Yak-15s or Il-10s, I've seen conflicting records. His RO, Master Sergeant Hans Haugland, later said the hardest part was staying calm during the intercept. You're watching a blip on a scope, calling corrections, and the pilot's life depends on your numbers being right. One miscalculation and you've just flown your aircraft into a mountain nobody saw. The Soviets never adapted. They kept flying the same patterns, assuming darkness protected them. By December, their night bombing effectiveness dropped 40%. Commanders blamed Sichuan, blamed bad weather, blamed everything except the possibility that Americans had put functional radar interceptors into the field. Soviet aircrew started refusing night missions. Reports from defectors after the war mentioned pilots claiming mechanical problems rather than fly into what they called the dark zone over Western Korea. The whales were feeding. November 3, 1952. Major William Stratton and his RO, Sergeant Hans Haugland, took off from K6 around 2130 hours. Standard patrol, orbit northwest of Pyongyang, wait for something to appear on the scope. Haugland picked up a contact at 2247. Bearing 315, range 13 miles, altitude approximately 18,000 feet. Moving south at maybe 180 knots. Slow enough to be a bomber, fast enough to be a jet. He called it out. Stratton turned into the intercept. Closed to 8 miles. 6 miles. The contact wasn't maneuvering, just holding course and altitude like the pilot had no idea anyone was watching. At 4 miles, Haugland confirmed lock and started feeding steering corrections. Left 2 degrees. Up slightly. Range closing. They broke through a cloud layer at 3,000 feet behind the target. Still couldn't see anything. Total darkness, no moon. The kind of night where your eyes play tricks and you start seeing shapes that aren't there. Haugland kept calling ranges. 2,000 feet. 1,500. Stratton fired. The tracers lit up the sky for maybe 2 seconds. Then something ahead exploded. Orange flash, debris tumbling, secondary detonation. Stratton pulled up hard and banked away. Hoagland was yelling confirmation, but Stratton already knew. You don't forget what an aircraft looks like when it comes apart. They landed at Koi 6 around midnight and filed the kill claim. Crew debriefing took an hour. Intelligence officers asked the same questions 3 times. Are you certain it was an aircraft? Did you visually identify it? What type was it? Stratton kept saying he never saw the target before he shot it. The radar guided him in. He fired when the RO called range. Something exploded. That's the report. 5th Air Force Intelligence rejected the claim. Their reasoning: insufficient visual confirmation. The explosion could have been anything. Ground fire hitting a decoy, a malfunction in Stratton's own weapon system, spatial disorientation leading him to fire at a false contact. They'd seen radar operators track clouds before. They'd seen pilots report kills that turned out to be flares. Without wreckage or visual ID, they weren't crediting it. The Marines were furious. Hoagland's radar track was clean. Consistent bearing, steady altitude, Doppler signature matching an aircraft. Ground observers near Pyongyang reported an explosion at the right time and location. But Air Force doctrine still required visual confirmation for air-to-air kills, a rule written when radar was primitive and unreliable. 3 weeks later, a patrol found wreckage. Yak-15 components scattered across a hillside northwest of Pyongyang. The debris field matched Stratton's reported intercept location within 2 miles. Someone at 5th Air Force quietly upgraded the claim to confirmed without issuing a press release. This happened again in December. And January. Skynight crews would report radar-guided kills. Intelligence would reject them. Wreckage would turn up later. The Air Force seemed institutionally incapable of accepting that you could shoot down an aircraft you never actually saw. I think it offended their sense of how air combat worked. Fighter pilots were supposed to be hunters, eyes sharp, reflexes fast, courage tested in visual dogfights. Letting a radar operator in a dark cockpit guide you onto a target you couldn't see felt like cheating. Or maybe just felt like the future, which is worse. By February 1953, 5th Air Force stopped rejecting Skynight kill claims. The evidence was overwhelming. The Marines had developed a night intercept capability the Air Force couldn't match, using an aircraft the Air Force had already rejected as inadequate. Nobody wanted to talk about what that implied for the F-94 program or the millions spent developing it. The MiG-15 was a better aircraft than the Skynight in every measurable way, except the one that mattered. Soviet engineers had built something genuinely impressive. Swept wings, a Klimov VK-1 engine producing 5,950 pounds of thrust, a service ceiling above 50,000 feet. It could hit Mach 0.92 in a dive. American test pilots who flew captured MiGs admitted the thing handled beautifully, responsive, stable, forgiving of mistakes. In daylight, against Sabres, it was competitive. Sometimes better. Against the Skynight, it was a flying coffin. Speed means nothing when you don't know you're being hunted. The MiG-15's climb rate was exceptional, 10,000 feet per minute under the right conditions. Worthless when the guy tracking you already knows your altitude, heading, and airspeed before you cross the Yalu. Maneuverability? The MiG could outturn almost anything America fielded. Hard to exploit when 20 millimeter rounds are tearing through your fuselage before you realize someone's behind you. Soviet pilots trusted their speed. That was the doctrine. Get in fast. Deliver your bombs or provide escort. Get out before the Americans could react. Night missions were supposed to be safer because American radar was primitive and their night fighters were scattered and ineffective. Intelligence reports from 1951 supported this. Then 1952 happened, and suddenly aircraft were disappearing. The reports I've seen from Soviet archives, declassified in the 90s, show confusion more than anything else. Pilots would report mechanical failures or navigation errors. Nobody wanted to admit they'd been shot down by something they never saw. One MiG-15 pilot who survived a Skynight attack described it as being hit by anti-aircraft fire at bomber altitude. He literally didn't believe it was an aircraft until the debriefing. Here's what kills me. The Soviets knew about radar intercept systems. They'd captured German equipment in 1945, studied British designs, developed their own ground-based radar networks. But they apparently never considered that Americans would put a functional intercept radar on a carrier-capable aircraft and deploy it to Korea. The institutional failure is staggering. Soviet doctrine also didn't emphasize electronic warfare training. MiG pilots received minimal instruction on radar warning receivers, which many didn't have installed anyway. The concept of radar signature management didn't exist. They flew the same altitudes, same speeds, same routes, radiating radar returns like searchlights in the dark. American crews exploited this ruthlessly. Captain James Weaver got 2 kills in one night, January 12, 1953, by positioning his Skynight along a known bomber route and just waiting. His RO, Sergeant Joseph Minier, picked up both contacts within 15 minutes. Same approach vector, same altitude. Weaver shot them both down before either crew transmitted a distress call. The speed advantage that made MiG-15s dominant in daylight became irrelevant at night. A Skynight cruising at 180 knots could track a MiG doing 400 knots, calculate the intercept geometry, position for an attack, and fire, all while the MiG pilot assumed he was untouchable. Soviet pilots kept trusting their airspeed indicator right up until the moment their aircraft disintegrated. 5th Air Force intelligence estimated Soviet night operations effectiveness dropped 60% between November 1952 and March 1953. Bomber sorties decreased. MiG escorts became erratic. Some nights, nobody crossed the Yalu at all. The Soviets never mounted a meaningful countертactics program. No radar jamming, no escort modifications, no route variations. Just kept feeding aircraft into the dark and losing them to a jet they'd mocked as obsolete. Pride's expensive when someone else is paying the bill. January 1953 was when the Marines stopped pretending to be polite about it. 6 confirmed kills in 31 days. All at night. All beyond visual range. VMFN 513 crews were painting red stars on their Skynights so fast the maintenance guys couldn't keep up. The squadron scoreboard at K6 looked like someone had gone crazy with a stamp. Captain Eugene O'Brien got one on January 10th, Yak-15, hit so hard it broke apart mid-air. Debris scattered across 15 miles of North Korean countryside. Major Stratton added another on the 12th, his 4th overall. Then Weaver got his double kill on the same night, which I mentioned earlier but bears repeating, because shooting down 2 enemy jets in one sortie was the kind of thing that usually made headlines. Didn't this time. The Air Force press office buried it in routine operational summaries. I think they were embarrassed. Here's why. The Air Force had spent years and millions developing the F-94 Starfire as their premier night fighter. Lockheed design, cutting edge for 1949, radar-equipped, jet-powered. It was supposed to be the future of all-weather interception, and it had exactly 0 confirmed kills in Korea. 0. Meanwhile, these Marine pilots and their ugly Navy cast-offs were erasing Soviet aircraft like they were running a shooting gallery. The F-94 guys flew patrols, burned fuel, occasionally tracked contacts, never fired their guns in anger. VMFN 513 was averaging a kill every 5 days. 5th Air Force started asking uncomfortable questions. Why were Marine squadrons outperforming dedicated Air Force night fighter units? Was it training? Equipment? Luck? Some colonels supposedly visited K6 in February to observe Skynight operations and left without making an official report. Draw your own conclusions. The Marines weren't shy about their success. Lieutenant Colonel Max Harper, Squadron CO, gave an interview to Pacific Stars and Stripes where he basically said the Skynight was proving itself the most effective night interceptor in theater. Not one of the most effective. The most effective. Air Force Public Affairs had that quote pulled from later editions. Soviet response was to keep doing exactly what they'd been doing. Same routes, same altitudes, same formations. I've read analysis suggesting Soviet Far East Command didn't believe the loss reports. Easier to assume crews were fabricating mechanical problems than accept that Americans had achieved night intercept superiority. Bureaucratic inertia at its finest. By late January, Skynight crews were getting so many contacts they started being selective. If the radar return looked like a slow-moving bomber, worth pursuing. Fast mover that might be a MiG-15 providing escort, also worth it. Single aircraft, uncertain signature, possibly just a transport? Maybe let that one go and save ammunition for better targets. This is what air superiority looks like, when you can afford to be choosy about which enemy aircraft you shoot down. The kill tally kept climbing. Captain Oliver Davis got one on January 18th. First Lieutenant Robert Bick added another on the 23rd. Each confirmation required paperwork, witness statements, radar plots, gun camera footage when available. The intelligence officers were drowning in it, and the Air Force just watched. Their F-94s kept flying patrols with nothing to show for it. Their F-86 Sabres dominated the daylight, but couldn't operate at night. The Marines had solved the night intercept problem using an aircraft the Air Force had literally rejected years earlier. Some lessons are harder to learn than others, especially when your ego's invested in being wrong. By February, Soviet night operations over Western Korea had effectively stopped. The darkness belonged to the whales now. The Soviets had warning systems. They had intelligence networks. They had defector reports and captured equipment and every advantage short of actual competence. And they still couldn't figure out how to stop losing aircraft. Soviet Far East Air Force Command knew by December 1952 that something was killing their planes. The loss pattern was obvious. Aircraft disappearing over specific sectors, no distress calls, wreckage found days later with bullet damage. They knew it was happening at night. They knew the Americans had deployed some kind of radar-equipped interceptor. Their response was to issue tactical directives that changed essentially nothing. Directive 447S, dated January 8, 1953, instructed pilots to maintain irregular altitude variations during bombing approaches and exercise vigilance for enemy aircraft. That's it. No electronic warfare training, no route randomization, no escort modifications. Just fly unpredictably and keep your eyes open. At night, in total darkness, against radar-guided interceptors. You can't see radar with your eyes. Soviet tactical doctrine apparently hadn't absorbed this fact. Chinese units adapted slightly better. They started varying their approach times and occasionally used decoy formations. Didn't help much. The Skynights tracked them anyway. Radar doesn't care if you're a bomber or a decoy. It cares about radar cross-section and Doppler shift. The Marines just shot whatever appeared on the scope. Soviet pilots kept reporting mechanical failures rather than admit they'd been intercepted. One MiG-15 pilot claimed engine failure forced him to eject over friendly territory. Investigators found his aircraft 60 miles inside North Korea with 20-meter holes through the tail section and both wings. He stuck to his story. Command accepted it because acknowledging the truth meant acknowledging systemic failure. The warning signs were everywhere. Soviet signal intelligence had intercepted Marine radio traffic discussing radar contacts and night intercepts. Ground observers reported explosions at altitude corresponding to missing aircraft. Maintenance crews examining recovered wreckage found gun damage patterns inconsistent with anti-aircraft fire. Someone at headquarters should have connected these dots and demanded tactical revision. Nobody did. I think Soviet command structure was too rigid. Admitting the Americans had achieved technological superiority meant someone had failed. either the intelligence service for not detecting the threat earlier, or tactical planning for not countering it, or pilot training for not preparing crews. Easier to attribute losses to weather, navigation errors, mechanical issues. Keep the bureaucracy happy. Keep your job. Let someone else worry about why aircraft keep disappearing. Chinese pilots were more pragmatic. By March 1953, they'd largely abandoned night operations over Western Korea. Just stopped flying there. Soviet units continued for another 2 months before quietly scaling back. No official policy change, no admission of failure. Sorties just decreased until night bombing effectively ceased. The Marines noticed. Intercept frequency dropped from multiple contacts per mission to maybe one every 3 nights. Captain Davis flew 7 consecutive patrols in April without firing his guns. The ROs spent hours staring at empty scopes. VMFN 513's final tally was 11 confirmed kills, exclusively nocturnal, exclusively radar-guided. VMFN 542 added a few more. Total Skynight kills in Korea, somewhere between 15 and 18 depending on which records you trust. More than any other jet aircraft in night combat. More than the entire F-94 program combined. The Soviets never publicly acknowledged what happened. Their official histories mention increased anti-aircraft effectiveness and adverse weather conditions affecting night operations. No mention of American night fighters. No discussion of tactical failures. Easier to blame the weather than admit a fat, ugly whale ate your Air Force. The F-3D Skynight ended the Korean War with the best night fighter kill ratio in theater, and nobody remembers it. When the armistice was signed in July 1953, the press wanted stories about sabers and MiGs, daylight dogfights at the Yalu, aces with 5 kills posing for photographers. The Skynight crews went home quietly. No parade, no Medal of Honor recipients, no Hollywood adaptation, just orders to new duty stations and another assignment. Marine Corps kept flying them for another decade. They proved useful in Vietnam, not as fighters, but as electronic warfare platforms and night interdiction aircraft. The radar systems got upgraded, the crews got older, and eventually the whole program faded into obscurity. Last operational Skynights were retired in 1970. Most got scrapped. A few ended up in museums where they sit next to Corsairs and Phantoms, and visitors walk past them without stopping. The Air Force never acknowledged that their F-94 program was a failure. Official histories credit the Starfire with essential air defense contributions, despite 0 combat kills. Lockheed kept building them until 1954. Some served with Air National Guard units into the early 60s, protecting American airspace from threats that never materialized. Meanwhile, the aircraft that actually worked, that actually killed enemy jets in combat, got written out of the narrative. I've seen aviation history books that don't mention the Skynight at all. Others give it a footnote. Navy night fighter, limited service in Korea. 16 confirmed kills isn't limited service. It's dominance. Here's what bothers me. The Skynight proved radar-guided interception was viable in 1952. The technology worked, the tactics worked, the training produced results. This should have revolutionized air combat doctrine. Instead, the Air Force spent the next decade chasing faster, higher, more complicated interceptors, while ignoring the fundamental lesson. Detection range matters more than performance envelope. The Soviets learned nothing either. Their night fighter development continued along the same trajectory. Faster aircraft, better engines, swept wings. No emphasis on radar capabilities until much later. They kept building MiG variants optimized for dogfighting when the future was already.
The 2nd of October 1959, a conference room deep within the sprawling ochre-colored headquarters of the main intelligence directorate, the GRU in Moscow. The air is thick with the sweet, acrid smoke of Papalacha cigarettes. General Ivan Serov, the GRU's notoriously brutal chief, listens with an air of bored impatience as a colonel from the Northern Fleet Directorate concludes his report. The maps spread across the vast oak table are dominated by the color blue, the deep cold blue of the Arctic Ocean. To the men in this room, this was not a desolate wasteland. It was the roof of the world, and it was theirs. It was the great northern wall of the Soviet Union, an impenetrable fortress of ice and polar night. From their fortified naval bases on the Kola Peninsula, their nuclear submarines could slip beneath the ice pack, invisible and lethal. From a string of hardened airfields dotting the Siberian coastline, their Tupolev Tu-95 Bear bombers could fly the shortest route over the pole to targets in the United States. Their early warning radar lines, a sprawling network of steel and electronics, were meant to be an unbreakable electronic tripwire. The colonel's pointer taps on the immense white mass of Greenland. He dismisses it with a wave. "A strategic void," he states, his voice echoing the room's consensus. "American B, 52 seconds from Thule, can be tracked from the moment they lift off. The landmass itself is useless, uninhabitable, an entire continent buried under 2 miles of ice. Nature itself defends our northern flank." Serov nods, satisfied. Soviet doctrine was built on this certainty. They understood brute force, they understood geography, they understood the crushing, absolute power of a Siberian winter, and Greenland was a winter that never ended. They believed the Americans, for all their technological trickery, were still bound by the same physical laws. You could not build a fortress on a moving river of ice. You could not hide an army in a place where the temperature dropped to 60 below zero and the sun vanished for months. The idea was absurd. It was a law of physics. This confidence, this deep, unshakable belief in the immutable reality of the Arctic was the very foundation of their strategic defense. Then came the first report. It was nothing. A piece of intelligence static, so strange and insignificant it was almost discarded. A source within the Danish Ministry of Defense mentioned an unusual volume of shipping heading for Thule Air Base. The manifests were bland. Prefabricated building materials, scientific equipment, drilling machinery, even things as mundane as railroad ties and tons of sewer pipe. The official cover story was perfectly plausible. The US Army was establishing a small scientific research station on the ice cap, a project called Camp Century. It was to be a showcase of polar engineering for the world to see, a gesture of peaceful scientific exploration. But the numbers felt wrong to a lone, detail-obsessed GRU analyst in the Naval Intelligence section. The sheer tonnage, 150,000 tons of equipment and supplies. The analyst scribbled a calculation on a notepad. That was the logistical footprint of a small city, not a remote science station. He flagged the report, appending a single, skeptical question. For what scientific purpose does one require a portable nuclear reactor? The question hung in the air, a phantom that refused to dissipate. A nuclear reactor in the middle of the Greenland ice sheet. It was a detail so audacious, so far outside the realm of conventional thinking, that it was initially dismissed as either a misunderstanding or a piece of bizarre American excess. But the phantom grew. Whispers from construction contractors in the United States spoke of a gargantuan ice drilling machine, a Swiss-made monster designed to chew through glacial ice, carving massive trenches. More manifests were intercepted. The pieces didn't fit the picture of a peaceful scientific outpost. They fit the picture of something else entirely. Something impossible. Something being built in secret, in the one place the Soviet High Command believed was a permanent, frozen sanctuary. Their confidence in the laws of nature was absolute. But they were about to discover that the Americans were trying to write new laws. If you want to understand the true stories of American ingenuity that shaped the Cold War, subscribe now to Cold War Impact. The Soviet certainty in their Arctic fortress was not arrogance, it was earned. They had faced down the American technological spectre before and won. In 1960, their new S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile system had reached up and torn Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane from the stratosphere, a height previously believed to be untouchable. The victory was total. It was a technological, military, and propaganda coup that sent a shockwave through the CIA and the White House. The invincible eye in the sky had been blinded. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had brandished the wreckage like a trophy, proof that Soviet might could answer any American challenge. For the Kremlin, the U-2 incident solidified a core belief. American technology was impressive but finite. It could be studied, countered, and defeated with focused, state-driven will. Their air defense network, the PVO, was a source of immense national pride. It was a complex, layered system of radars, command bunkers, and thousands of interceptor aircraft and missile batteries, all designed to seal the nation's borders from intrusion. After swatting down the U-2, they believed there was no corner of the Soviet sky that was not under their watch. The Arctic, with its brutal weather and sparse population, was the easiest part of this border to secure. Any threat would have to come from the air, and their victory over the U-2 proved the air was no longer a safe haven for their enemy. This is why the faint signals from Greenland were so deeply unsettling. They didn't fit the paradigm. It wasn't an aircraft they were hunting. It wasn't a ship. It was an idea, a creeping suspicion that their entire strategic map of the world had a flaw they couldn't see, buried under a continent of ice. While the GRU was chasing shadows, the United States Army was facing a stark and terrifying problem. The U-2 shootdown had been a disaster. President Eisenhower's hopes for a diplomatic summit with Khrushchev had evaporated. More importantly, the primary method of gathering intelligence on Soviet missile capabilities was gone. The Americans were flying blind. Simultaneously, the missile gap was becoming a public terror. The Soviets had launched Sputnik in 1957, proving their rocketry was powerful. The fear was that they were building hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles in secret weapons that could strike the US mainland in under 30 minutes. America's own ICBMs, the Atlas and Titan, were still liquid-fueled, took hours to prepare for launch, and were stationed in exposed, above-ground silos. They were terrifyingly vulnerable to a Soviet first strike. The Pentagon needed a solution. They needed a weapon that was close enough to strike key targets in the Soviet Union quickly, but that was also completely immune to a surprise attack. It needed to be invisible. The answer came not from the sky, but from beneath the ice. It was a plan of almost science fiction-level ambition, codenamed Project Iceworm. The concept was breathtakingly simple and logistically nightmarish. Build a sprawling network of tunnels hundreds of miles long, deep inside the Greenland ice sheet. Inside these tunnels, on a system of railway tracks, would be 600 specially modified medium-range ballistic missiles, each armed with a nuclear warhead. These missile launchers would be constantly moving, their exact positions unknown even to their operators until the moment of launch. It would be a hidden, mobile, undetectable nuclear arsenal, a perfect, survivable second strike capability. To the Soviets, who saw the Arctic as an obstacle, the Americans saw it as camouflage. The very thing that made Greenland inhospitable, the colossal, ever-shifting ice sheet, was the key to the entire plan. The ice would provide a near-impenetrable shield against a nuclear blast, and its sheer scale would make finding the missile sites impossible. But before they could build the weaponized city of Iceworm, they first had to prove they could build any city under the ice. This was the true purpose of Camp Century. It was the pilot program, the proof of concept, disguised as a benign scientific research station. In 1959, the US Army Corps of Engineers began one of the most extraordinary construction projects in human history. Using the massive Swiss ice-cutting machines, they carved enormous trenches into the ice cap. These trenches were then covered with arched steel roofs and buried under tons of snow and ice, creating a series of massive subsurface tunnels. Inside this surreal, sunless world, they assembled an entire town. There were prefabricated buildings housing barracks for 200 soldiers, a state-of-the-art science lab, a hospital, a library, a theatre, a church, and a mess hall. It was all powered by the Alco PM2 Amperes, the world's first portable nuclear reactor, a miracle of miniaturization that provided all the light, heat, and power the city needed. Camp Century was a demonstration of absolute environmental mastery. It was a statement that American engineering and willpower could conquer the most hostile place on Earth. It was the Phantom taking form, a secret military base hiding in plain sight, a dagger being positioned just over the roof of the world, ready to strike at the heart of the Soviet Empire. And for now, Moscow saw nothing but a few confusing shipping manifests. By early 1961, the trickle of disturbing intelligence had become a torrent. The lone GRU analyst's skeptical query had blossomed into a full-blown, high-priority investigation. The file, codenamed Ledionoy Cherv Iceworm, was now passed up the chain of command, landing on the desk of a senior general in the Strategic Missile Forces. The general, a veteran of Stalingrad whose mind was accustomed to thinking in terms of steel, concrete, and artillery divisions, read the compiled reports with growing incredulity. The action was not a frantic scramble of jets, but a quiet, desperate battle fought in archives and analysis rooms. GRU assets in Copenhagen were tasked with obtaining every scrap of information related to American activity in Greenland, a Danish territory. They acquired public-facing engineering journals, press releases from the US Army, even tourist pamphlets. On the surface, it all supported the cover story, a marvel of peaceful science. But when the Soviet analysts laid it all out, the picture became grotesque. They cross-referenced the publicly available dimensions of the ice trenches with the declared purpose of housing scientific labs. The scale was wrong. The trenches were far too large, too long, too structurally robust for mere climate research. Then came the aerial reconnaissance photos. American planes flew regular supply runs to Camp Century, and Soviet long-range aircraft, skirting the edges of Greenland's airspace, managed to get a handful of blurry, high-altitude images of the construction site. What they saw was a massive industrial operation, a scar on the ice sheet far larger than any science station required. The heat signatures from the site, captured by experimental infrared sensors on a passing spy satellite, were another anomaly. The output was consistent not with a small camp, but with a significant power source, the nuclear reactor. The chase was intellectual, a desperate hunt for the true design. Analysts reverse-engineered the logistics. They calculated the food, the fuel, the water produced by melting ice, the sheer volume of breathable air required. The conclusion was always the same. This was a permanent, self-sustaining, underground settlement for hundreds, built to military-grade specifications. The final horrifying puzzle piece clicked into place when an analyst overlaid a map of the Soviet Union with trajectory plots from Greenland. The location wasn't random, it was a perfectly calculated position. From the ice cap, medium-range missiles weapons far cheaper and more numerous than ICBMs could reach every critical target west of the Ural Mountains. Moscow, Leningrad, the submarine pens of the Northern Fleet, the launch sites for their own ICBMs. It was a dagger poised directly over the heartland of the Soviet state, held by an invisible hand. The GRU had been searching for an enemy army and found a ghost town buried in the ice. Their entire defensive doctrine for the Arctic, the Great Northern Wall, had been rendered obsolete without a single shot being fired. It had been flanked, undermined, and hollowed out from within by an enemy who refused to play by the established rules of geography and warfare. While analysts in Moscow were piecing together this terrifying mosaic, life inside Camp Century proceeded with an almost surreal normality. For the US, Army engineers and scientists living there, the Cold War was a distant abstraction. Their reality was the constant, faint hum of the nuclear reactor and the compressed, recycled air in their lungs. They walked through brilliantly lit tunnels carved from ancient, blue-white ice. Their world was one of routine. Mornings were spent monitoring the massive drilling machines, taking ice core samples, or maintaining the complex life support systems. An engineer from Texas could leave his private quarters, walk down a corridor of ice to the mess hall, and get a hot breakfast of scrambled eggs and bacon, cooked with power generated by atomic fission. He could then go to the base library and read yesterday's newspaper flown in from New York, or visit the hobby shop to work on a model airplane. In the evenings, the men would gather in the theater to watch a Hollywood movie, the sound of John Wayne's voice echoing off the frozen walls. They had a hospital with a full-time doctor, a post office that sent and received mail weekly, and a church with a chaplain. They were living in the most hostile environment on the planet, yet they had created a slice of American suburbia 200 feet beneath a glacier. The project was an immense source of pride. They were pioneers, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. They knew their work was important, but few understood its ultimate strategic purpose. They were simply focused on the task at hand, proving that man could build and sustain a community in the eternal cold and dark. Their calm, methodical work, their very existence in this impossible place, was a quiet testament to an ideology of limitless possibility. They were not just surviving the environment, they were dominating it with ingenuity and overwhelming logistical power. This serene domestic scene, powered by a harnessed atom, was the source of the frantic panic growing thousands of miles away in the Kremlin. The final report on Project Iceworm was a psychological bombshell dropped into the heart of the Soviet High Command. It was no longer a theory. It was a fact. The Americans had built an operational, nuclear-powered military base under the Greenland ice. The shock was not merely strategic, it was existential. The Soviet system was built on the mastery of material reality, on the belief that ideology could move mountains. But here were the Americans, literally moving a glacier. The discovery was a profound humiliation. It felt like an act of supreme contempt. The Americans hadn't bothered to hide the shipping manifests. They had brazenly announced the construction of Camp Century, cloaking their military ambition in the thin veil of science, confident that the sheer audacity of the project would be its own best camouflage. They knew the Soviets would never believe it was possible, and so they hid their fortress in plain sight. For the stoic generals of the Red Army, this was a new and terrifying kind of warfare. It wasn't about tanks or missiles. It was about imagination. The Americans hadn't just built a base, they had weaponized the climate itself. They had taken the single greatest symbol of Russia's strength, the unforgiving winter that had defeated Napoleon and Hitler, and turned it into a forward operating base. The shock was the realization that while they had been building walls, the Americans had been building doors in places the Soviets didn't even know could exist. The enemy wasn't at the gate. The enemy was under the floorboards of the world, and they had no idea how to get to them. The revelation of Camp Century was not the end of the nightmare for Soviet strategic planners. It was the beginning. Their initial shock morphed into a grim, methodical analysis of the true threat. The single base, as terrifying as it was, could theoretically be targeted, however difficult. But the GRU's deeper analysis, based on extrapolating the engineering data and logistical capacity demonstrated at Camp Century, revealed a far more horrifying reality. This was not a standalone fortress. It was a prototype, a single node in what was intended to be a sprawling subterranean nervous system of nuclear death. The Americans weren't just building a base, they were perfecting a system of concealment and deployment that could be replicated on an immense scale. Project Iceworm, in its fully realized form, called for over 2,500 miles of tunnels to be dug beneath the ice sheet. This labyrinth would house 60 launch centers, each controlling 10 mobile missile launchers. The system was designed for perpetual motion. The 600 nuclear missiles, mounted on rail cars, would constantly shift their positions within the network, their locations randomized by a central computer. The vastness and constant movement would make a preemptive strike impossible. Even if Soviet intelligence managed to pinpoint one launch site, by the time a missile could be targeted and fly over the pole, the American launcher would have moved to a new, unknown location deep within the ice. This transformed the threat from a static dagger into a swarm of invisible scorpions. It was a systematic negation of every principle of Soviet defense. Their strategy was based on identifying and destroying fixed targets, airfields, command bunkers, and missile silos. The Iceworm system had no fixed targets. It was a fluid living weapon that used the entire Greenland ice cap as its shield. The Soviet High Command now understood. The engineers at Camp Century weren't just building a camp, they were writing the instruction manual for a new kind of nuclear war, one for which the Soviets had no countermove and no defense. The routine of life in the ice tunnels, the mundane reports on drilling progress and reactor efficiency, were in fact the methodical steps of a systematic campaign to hold a gun to the head of the Soviet Union. The practical application of this system was demonstrated through the engineering marvels that made Camp Century possible. Each success was a case study in American ingenuity that left Soviet engineers, who were accustomed to solving problems with sheer scale and brute force, in a state of grudging awe. The primary instrument of this new warfare was not a bomber or a tank, but a machine that looked like a colossal industrial slug. The tunnel, cutting machine, built in Switzerland to American specifications. Soviet intelligence pored over the few available photographs and design schematics. The machine was a monster, weighing over 150 tons. It didn't drill or blast, it milled. A series of rotating blades at its front would shave away the dense compacted ice and snow, which was then superheated by a jet of air and blown out behind the machine, where it quickly froze again, creating a smooth, structurally sound archway. It was a self-contained tunnel factory. In a single day, one machine could carve out a trench over half a mile long, large enough to accommodate a two-story building. To the Soviets, this was not just a piece of construction equipment. It was a weapon of creation, capable of building an underground empire at a speed they could not comprehend. Their own Arctic construction projects involved thousands of laborers, years of backbreaking work in permafrost, and massive, vulnerable supply lines of concrete and steel. The Americans had created a machine that simply ate the environment and excreted a fortress. The second, and more profound case study was the Alco PM2 Ampere's portable nuclear reactor. For Moscow, this was the heart of the entire terrifying system. The Soviets were a nuclear superpower, but their reactors were behemoths, requiring immense cooling facilities and thousands of personnel. The idea of a portable reactor that could be flown into a remote location, assembled by a small team, and provide years of uninterrupted power was borderline science fiction. The PM2 Amperes was the ultimate logistical trump card. It severed the entire iceworm concept from the need for vulnerable fuel convoys. The base could generate its own heat, its own light, its own electricity, and even its own water by melting the surrounding ice for years on end. It was a closed system, a self-sufficient organism living within the glacier. This technological leap demonstrated a fundamental difference in philosophy. The Soviet system relied on a massive, centralized, and ultimately brittle infrastructure. The Americans were creating decentralized, autonomous, and resilient nodes of power. The PM2 Amperes ensured that the city under the ice would never run out of energy. It could wait, hidden and patient, for as long as necessary. The most potent element of this new American dominance was not physical, but psychological. It was a symbol, born from the project's scientific cover story, that came to haunt the margins of Soviet intelligence reports. This was the symbol of the Ice Core. Publicly, the most important work being done at Camp Century was the drilling and analysis of the first deep ice cores in history. Scientists were extracting cylinders of ice from over 4,000 feet down, pulling up a frozen, uninterrupted record of the Earth's climate, going back over 100,000 years. In the trapped bubbles of ancient air, American scientists could read the story of ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and atmospheric changes. To the world, it was a triumph of geology and climate science. To the Soviet analysts in the GRU, it was the ultimate act of psychological warfare. The Americans were not just occupying the ice, they were dissecting it. They were reading its memory. While Soviet strategy was based on the surface reality of the Arctic, its vastness, its cold, its impassability, the Americans were plumbing its depths, understanding its very nature in a way the Soviets couldn't. This act of scientific mastery became a haunting metaphor. The enemy could read the history of the ground beneath their feet. This symbol, the pristine cylinder of ancient ice being lifted into the light, represented an intellectual and philosophical gap that technology alone could not explain. It was as if the Americans were operating on a different plane of existence. They weren't just fighting the Cold War on the political and military fronts, they were fighting it on a geological timescale. The Ice Core was a quiet, constant reminder that the enemy's knowledge ran deeper. They weren't just building a base on the ice, they were communing with it, learning its secrets to better weaponize it. The symbol of the Ice Core became a source of deep institutional anxiety, a testament to an enemy who seemed to draw power not just from their machines, but from their seemingly limitless capacity to understand and manipulate the natural world itself. The final, synthesized GRU report on Project Iceworm did not land on a general's desk. It was hand-delivered in a locked briefcase to a handful of men in the Politburo. Within the Kremlin's silent, cavernous halls, the news was received not with shouts of anger, but with a cold, heavy dread. The map of Greenland on the wall of the strategic planning room was no longer a blank white space representing a natural barrier. In the minds of the Soviet leadership, it was now a blood-red stain, a forward base for an invisible enemy. The realization was absolute. Their nation was strategically checkmated from an angle they had never even conceived of. Premier Khrushchev, a man of volatile temper and immense pride, reportedly fell into a grim silence upon being briefed. The humiliation of the U-2 affair had been public, but this was something far more insidious. This was a private, institutional shame. It was a failure of imagination, a failure to understand their adversary. The Americans had not outmuscled them, they had thought them on a fundamental level. The immediate demand passed down to the military, and the KGB was not for retaliation, but for a solution. The ghost in the ice had to be found, and if it could not be found, it had to be rendered impotent. This directive sparked the Soviet Union's great countermeasure, a two-pronged approach born of desperation and immense national expenditure. The first prong was a brute force replication, the accelerated development of their own submarine-launched ballistic missile program. If the Americans could hide missiles under the ice, the Soviets would hide them under the oceans. It was a logical, if astronomically expensive reaction. But the second prong was the true big bet. It was a secret, high-stakes technological quest to pierce the veil of the Greenland ice sheet itself. They would not just match the American threat, they would expose it, map it, and hold it under the threat of their own targeting systems. This became one of the most ambitious and secret intelligence-gathering efforts of the 1960s. A new specialized department was formed, a joint venture between the GRU's technical branch and the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Their singular mission: find Project Iceworm. They threw every conceivable technology at the problem. Specially equipped fishing trawlers, bristling with sensitive hydrophones and gravimeters, began methodically charting the waters around Greenland, listening for the faintest seismic tremor from the construction deep inland. A new generation of spy satellites, the Zenit series, were programmed to make repeated, low-orbit passes, using experimental ground-penetrating radar in a futile attempt to see through the ice. They funded massive research programs into magnetometry, hoping that the steel tunnels and nuclear reactor would create a detectable magnetic anomaly. It was a monumental effort, a testament to the Soviet system's ability to mobilize its entire scientific industrial complex towards a single goal. But it was destined to fail from the start, for a reason rooted in the technical truth of the environment itself. The American planners at the Pentagon had chosen their battlefield with genius. The Greenland ice sheet is not a static block of ice. It is a living, breathing, moving entity. It is a continent-sized glacier, flowing inexorably towards the sea, albeit at a slow pace. This movement creates immense internal stresses. The ice groans, cracks, and shifts constantly. Deep within the glacier, rivers of meltwater carve their own tunnels. The entire landmass is alive with a cacophony of seismic noise. The Soviet challenge was therefore not like finding a needle in a haystack. It was like trying to hear a single human heartbeat in the middle of a continuous earthquake. Their incredibly sensitive instruments performed exactly as designed. They were flooded with data. They detected thousands of seismic events, mapped hundreds of subglacial caverns, and traced the paths of immense hidden rivers. They produced the most detailed maps of Greenland's subterranean geography in existence. But the sheer volume of this natural noise created a perfect, impenetrable shield of static. The vibrations from the American tunnel-boring machine, the faint heat signature of the reactor, the magnetic field of the steel structures, all of it was swallowed whole by the overwhelming geological reality of the ice sheet. Nature itself was providing the Americans with the ultimate camouflage. The very thing the Soviets were trying to listen to was deafening them. The killer statistic that emerged from this decade-long multi-billion ruble effort was never published, but it was enshrined in the final, classified report that officially terminated the search in the early 1970s. Over the course of the project, Soviet intelligence agencies had collected and analyzed more than 4 million square kilometers of remote sensing data from Greenland. The final conclusion stated that while they had successfully identified over 8,000 distinct, naturally occurring subglacial anomalies, caves, rivers, and stress fractures, they could not, with any degree of confidence, distinguish a single man-made object among them. The American ghost remained a ghost. The big bet had failed. The psychological toll of this failure was corrosive. It gnawed at the confidence of the Soviet military establishment. They were masters of a doctrine built on numbers, mass, and observable force. Yet they were haunted by an unquantifiable, unlocatable threat. Every strategic calculation, every wargame, now had a terrifying asterisk, assuming no launch from the Greenland sector. It fostered a deep-seated paranoia. The Americans were not just opponents, they were magicians, capable of bending the laws of nature to their will. This failure also fed a growing, unspoken fear within the system, that they were locked in a technological race with an opponent who was not just a few steps ahead, but was running on a different track altogether. The vast sums of money poured into the failed search for Iceworm were resources diverted from other critical areas, further straining their command economy. The Phantom under the ice didn't need to fire a single missile to inflict damage. Its mere existence was a slow-acting poison, draining treasure, creating doubt, and proving that in the new atomic age, the most powerful weapon was not the one you could see, but the one you could only imagine. The colossal, secret failure to locate Project Iceworm was more than a technical shortcoming. It was a damning verdict on the entire Soviet system. It exposed a terminal ideological illness. The Soviet command economy, a marvel of brute force industrialization, was perfectly suited to winning the Second World War. It could produce tanks, artillery, and rifles by the millions, overwhelming an enemy with sheer, standardized mass. It could imitate and replicate captured Western technology with remarkable speed, but it was pathologically incapable of genuine, paradigm-shifting innovation. The system was a pyramid, with all ideas flowing from the top down. 5-year plans, dictated by the party, demanded adherence to quotas and established norms. A factory manager was rewarded for producing 105% of his target for existing tractor designs, not for wasting resources on a theoretical new engine. A military engineer was promoted for refining the armor on a T-series tank, not for proposing a radical new form of warfare that required unproven technology. The very structure of the state stifled the kind of eccentric, high-risk, high-reward thinking that gave birth to projects like Iceworm. To a Soviet planner, the idea of building a nuclear-powered city inside a moving glacier would have been career suicide, a fantastical waste of state resources. To the American military-industrial complex, with its competing branches, its deep-pocketed research agencies like DARPA, and its network of private contractors all vying for the next big idea, it was just another audacious problem to be solved. This was the fundamental macro failure that Iceworm laid bare. The Soviets were playing a game of chess, meticulously and logically, but their opponent was playing a different game on a different board, a game whose rules the Soviets couldn't even comprehend. While Moscow poured its wealth into building more missiles, more submarines, and more interceptors to counter threats they understood, America was investing in the intellectual infrastructure that could create threats no one had ever imagined. The failure to find the base in Greenland was the ultimate proof of this gap. They were trying to solve a problem of imagination with instruments of detection. They were searching for a physical object when the true weapon was the idea itself, an idea born of a culture of freedom, scientific inquiry, and decentralized innovation, the very things the Soviet system was designed to suppress. And then came the ultimate, undeniable demonstration of this systemic collapse, the 9th of November, 1989, the Berlin Wall. For 28 years, it had stood as the perfect physical manifestation of the Soviet ideology. It was a thing of crude brute force, concrete slabs, steel reinforcements, barbed wire, and guard towers. Its purpose was simple, direct, and unimaginative, to use overwhelming physical power to stop the movement of people and ideas. It was the Soviet system made manifest a rigid, ugly, and ultimately brittle barrier against human nature. That night, the wall did not fall to an artillery barrage or a tank assault. It was rendered obsolete by a force it was never designed to counter. The simple, unstoppable pressure of people who had decided they would no longer be contained. When the crowds surged through the checkpoints at Bornholmer Strasse, they exposed the great lie at the heart of the entire Eastern Bloc. The immense military machine, the tanks, the secret police, the vast ideological apparatus, it was all a hollow shell, powerless against the simple human desire to be free. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the final verdict on the system that had been privately haunted by Project Iceworm 3 decades earlier. The same intellectual rigidity that assumed a wall of concrete could permanently divide a city was the same rigidity that couldn't imagine an enemy building a base inside a glacier. Both failures stemmed from the same root, a profound underestimation of a dynamic world, whether the force in question was human aspiration or glacial mechanics. The wall was the Soviet Union's answer to a complex problem, a crude, physical barrier. Camp Century was America's, a complex, scientific, and invisible solution. When the people of Berlin swarmed over the wall with hammers and chisels, they weren't just tearing down a wall. They were symbolically dismantling the entire brute force philosophy that had failed to find the ghost in the ice, failed to compete in the technological race, and ultimately failed to deliver on its promise to its own people. The verdict was in, written not in a top-secret GRU file, but on the jubilant, graffiti-covered ruins of the Cold War's most infamous symbol. In an ironic twist of fate, nature, not Soviet intelligence, delivered the final blow to Project Iceworm. The American engineers, for all their genius, had made one critical miscalculation. They had believed the Greenland ice sheet was a relatively stable, static mass. They were wrong. By 1967, Constant, inexorable glacial pressure began to deform the tunnels. The perfectly straight corridors began to warp and shear. The barracks and labs, once models of subterranean order, were being slowly, unstoppably crushed. The project was deemed unsafe and abandoned. The portable nuclear reactor was removed, and the city under the ice was left to the darkness. But the physical failure of Camp Century is ultimately a footnote. Its true mission was a spectacular success. For years, the idea of Iceworm remained fully operational in the minds of the Soviet High Command. It was a psychological weapon of immense power, a ghost that diverted billions of rubles, warped strategic planning, and served as a constant, humiliating reminder of a technological and imaginative gap they could never hope to close. Today, the crushed remains of Camp Century lie entombed nearly half a mile deep, carried slowly towards the sea by the glacier that is its tomb. It is a lost artifact of the Cold War, a forgotten monument not to a successful military base, but to an ideology so confident, so audacious, that it dared to build a secret city of the future in a place of eternal ice. It stands in stark contrast to the legacy of its adversary, an empire that built walls to cage its own people, only to see them crumble into dust. The Cold War was a long twilight struggle, but in the end, it was decided by a simple truth, proven in the frozen dark beneath Greenland and in the torchlit streets of Berlin. A system that fears new ideas will always, eventually, be defeated by one that sets them free.